The German radio has just announced Hitler is dead.
The Second World War is one of the most studied events in history. Yet some parts of it feel deeply unsettling and hard to explain. Strange decisions, unexplained events, and chilling coincidences still disturb historians today. From mysterious military choices to stories that never fully add up, these moments raise quiet fear and uneasy questions. The more you look closely, the more it feels like something is missing from the story we were told. Number 20. Hitler is often blamed alone for Germany's defeat. Adolf Hitler is routinely portrayed as the sole architect of Nazi Germany's defeat, a convenient narrative that simplifies a far more complex collapse. After the war, many German generals claimed that Hitler's interference crippled military strategy, suggesting that Germany might have won if professional soldiers had been left in charge. What doesn't make sense is how heavily this narrative relies on testimony from the very people who needed someone else to blame. These officers were desperate to distance themselves from both military failure and moral responsibility. Hitler certainly made disastrous decisions, but he was not personally managing supply chains, fuel production, transportation networks, or industrial output. Germany faced chronic shortages of oil, steel, rubber, and food throughout the war, problems that existed regardless of who issued battlefield orders. These shortages shaped every campaign, including the reckless push eastward in search of resources. Blaming Hitler alone ignores the structural weaknesses of Germany's economy, its overextended military commitments, and the complicity of its leadership class. Germany was also fighting a war against opponents with vastly superior industrial capacity. The combined production power of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire dwarfed what Germany could sustain long-term. The idea that one man single-handedly lost the war allows others to escape accountability and creates the misleading impression that Nazi Germany was otherwise functional. In reality, the entire system was broken, brutal, and doomed by its own design. Number 19. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a military mistake. Operation Barbarossa, the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, is often described as a purely ideological crusade or a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. What's harder to reconcile is that it was also driven by Germany's growing desperation for resources. By 1940, Germany was struggling with severe shortages of oil, grain, and raw materials essential for sustaining a modern war. Conquest was not just expansionist ambition, it was survival strategy. Germany's leadership believed that seizing Soviet territory, particularly Ukraine and the Caucasus, would solve these problems. Ukraine's farmland promised food security, while Soviet oil fields seemed like a solution to Germany's crippling fuel shortages. This belief pushed Germany into a massive gamble, the largest land invasion in history, spanning an 1,800-mile front and involving more than 3.5 million troops. What doesn't make sense is how poorly prepared Germany was for the logistical demands of such an operation. The invasion assumed a quick collapse of the Soviet Union, an assumption rooted more in wishful thinking than realistic planning. When the Soviets resisted and the war dragged on, Germany found itself burning through resources faster than it could replace them. Barbarossa wasn't just a failed invasion, it was a self-inflicted catastrophe born from desperation. Number 18. Germany never completed a single operational aircraft carrier. Despite being a major industrial power fighting a global war, Nazi Germany never operated a functional aircraft carrier. The Kriegsmarine attempted to build one, the Graf Zeppelin, but it was never completed or deployed. What doesn't make sense is how a nation seeking world dominance neglected such a critical element of modern naval warfare. Aircraft carriers had already proven their value before and during the war. Britain, Japan, and the United States invested heavily in carrier fleets, understanding that control of the seas increasingly depended on air power. Germany, however, remained focused on land warfare and submarines. leaving its surface navy underdeveloped. Internal conflicts played a role. Hitler had little interest in naval strategy, while competing branches of the military fought over resources. Aircraft designs intended for carrier use were delayed, repurposed, or abandoned entirely. By the time Germany recognized the importance of carriers, it was too late. This lack of naval aviation left Germany vulnerable. Allied forces controlled shipping lanes, protected convoys, and projected power across oceans. Germany's inability to challenge this dominance contributed significantly to its eventual defeat. Number 17. The Phantom Air Raid over Los Angeles. In February 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, panic gripped the U.S. West Coast. Reports of unidentified objects in the sky triggered a full military response over Los Angeles. Searchlights swept the night sky, air raid sirens blared, and anti-aircraft batteries fired more than 1,400 rounds. What doesn't make sense is that nothing was ever found. No wreckage, no downed aircraft, no confirmed enemy presence. Some witnesses claimed to see planes or balloons. Others saw only clouds illuminated by explosions. The event became known as the Battle of Los Angeles, though no actual battle occurred. Despite the lack of casualties from enemy action, several civilians died from heart attacks and accidents during the blackout. Homes and buildings were damaged by falling shrapnel. Official explanations varied, ranging from weather balloons to stray flares, but none fully accounted for the scale of the response. The incident revealed how fear and uncertainty can override judgment. The U.S. military, on edge after Pearl Harbor, responded aggressively to incomplete information. The result was chaos, fueled by anxiety rather than enemy action. A reminder that wars are shaped as much by panic as by planning. Number 16. Many Germans claimed ignorance of the Holocaust. One of the most troubling claims after the Second World War was that ordinary Germans didn't know about the Holocaust. At face value, this assertion is difficult to reconcile with the scale and visibility of the genocide. The Holocaust required an enormous logistical system: concentration and extermination camps, guarded ghettos, mass deportations, and coordinated killings across occupied Europe. These were not isolated or secret operations carried out in complete silence, but state-run processes involving transportation networks, military units, police forces, and civilian infrastructure. Railway lines ran directly through cities and towns, carrying thousands of people in overcrowded cattle cars under armed guard. Civilians saw trains departing full and returning empty. In many areas, smoke and ash from nearby camps were visible for miles, accompanied by persistent odors that were impossible to ignore. Soldiers stationed on the Eastern Front wrote letters home describing mass shootings and reprisals, while rumors circulated among families, workplaces, and communities. Even without full knowledge of extermination methods, awareness that civilians were being deported, abused, and killed was widespread. The post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht further muddied the waters. This narrative claimed that Germany's regular army remained separate from Nazi crimes, placing responsibility solely on the SS. Historical evidence contradicts this. Wehrmacht units were involved in massacres, enforced starvation policies, and assisted in deportations. Recorded complaints from soldiers about SS killings paradoxically confirm awareness of the atrocities themselves. Fear, conformity, and propaganda undoubtedly shaped behavior. But the insistence on total ignorance raises questions about memory, accountability, and the psychological need to distance oneself from participation in mass violence. Number 15. German submariners had a mortality rate of roughly 75% by war's end. Early in the Second World War, German U-boats posed a terrifying threat to Allied shipping. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed submarines could strangle Britain by cutting off supplies, and for a time, they came close. What doesn't make sense is how completely that advantage evaporated and how catastrophic the consequences were for the crews. As the war progressed, Allied technology and tactics rapidly improved. Radar, sonar, depth charges, escort carriers, and coordinated convoy systems turned the Atlantic into a deadly trap for submarines. By the later years of the war, German U-boats were being detected and destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The result was staggering. Roughly 75% of German submariners were killed, one of the highest fatality rates of any military service in history. Crews often went to sea knowing they were unlikely to return. Conditions inside the submarines were horrific: cramped quarters, stale air, limited food, and constant fear. What makes this especially baffling is that German leadership continued sending crews into near-certain death even when the strategic value was minimal. Resources poured into a campaign that no longer offered meaningful results. The U-boat war became less about strategy and more about sunk costs, pride, and refusal to admit failure. Number 14. German V-1 and V-2 rockets terrified the Allies. Nazi Germany's advanced weapons programs, particularly the V-1 and V-2 rockets, became legendary symbols of terrifying technological superiority. At the time, Allied leaders feared these weapons could change the course of the war. London was bombarded, civilians were killed, and the psychological impact was immense. Yet what doesn't make sense is how little these weapons actually achieved strategically. The V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles were astonishing feats of engineering, but they were wildly inefficient. Accuracy was poor, reliability was inconsistent, and production costs were enormous. Many rockets malfunctioned, fell into empty fields, or missed targets entirely. Others exploded shortly after launch, wasting resources Germany could not afford to lose. The V-2 program alone consumed vast amounts of money, skilled labor, and raw materials, resources that could have been used for aircraft, tanks, or fuel production. Even worse, much of the manufacturing relied on forced labor, killing thousands of prisoners before the weapons ever reached the battlefield. Allied countermeasures further reduced their impact. Fighter pilots learned how to intercept V-1s, while bombing campaigns targeted launch sites and factories. Despite their fearsome reputation, these wonder weapons failed to disrupt Allied logistics or morale in any meaningful way. In the end, they became symbols of misplaced priorities, technological brilliance deployed too late, too inefficiently, and at far too high a cost. Number 13. The Soviet Union invaded Poland alongside Nazi Germany in 1939. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war, marking the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. What's often overlooked is that the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east just weeks later. Under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Nazi Germany and the USSR had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. What doesn't make sense is how quickly this invasion faded from moral scrutiny. Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland, deported civilians, and executed thousands of prisoners, including Polish officers. Yet within 2 years, the Soviet Union would be embraced as one of the Allied Big Three, fighting alongside Britain and the United States. This shift wasn't driven by moral reconsideration, but by necessity. When Hitler broke the pact and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the geopolitical landscape changed overnight. The Allies needed Soviet manpower, territory, and industrial capacity to defeat Germany. Holding Stalin accountable for earlier aggression became politically inconvenient. Poland, meanwhile, remained occupied, devastated, and largely voiceless in Allied decision-making. Its suffering was subordinated to strategic priorities. The contradiction is stark. One invader became the embodiment of evil, while another was rebranded as a reluctant ally. Number 12. Wehrmacht officers openly acknowledged knowledge of mass killings. After the Second World War, a comforting myth took hold in Germany and beyond, that the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, fought honorably while atrocities were committed only by the SS. This idea collapses under scrutiny. Numerous documents, eyewitness accounts, and recorded statements show that Wehrmacht personnel were fully aware of mass killings and, in many cases, actively participated in them. What doesn't make sense is how this narrative persisted for decades. Wehrmacht commanders were present during executions, coordinated logistics for deportations, and enforced starvation policies in occupied territories. Complaints recorded by officers about SS-led massacres demonstrate not ignorance, but awareness. You cannot object to something you do not know exists. Soldiers wrote letters home describing shootings of civilians and prisoners, particularly on the Eastern Front. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war further undermines the myth. Millions were deliberately starved, exposed, or executed, often under Wehrmacht supervision. These were not spontaneous acts of brutality, but part of an organized system. Even when individual soldiers expressed discomfort, they continued to serve within the machinery that enabled genocide. The persistence of the clean Wehrmacht story reflects a broader human tendency to separate oneself from guilt. Acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that ordinary soldiers, fathers, sons, and neighbors were involved in crimes on an industrial scale. The discomfort of that reality made denial easier, even when the evidence was overwhelming. Number 11. Hitler himself was heavily medicated. Despite his public image as a disciplined, iron-willed leader, Adolf Hitler was heavily medicated throughout the war. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, administered a staggering cocktail of substances, including stimulants, sedatives, opiates, hormones, and experimental compounds. Some injections were given multiple times a day. What doesn't make sense is how this reliance was tolerated or even ignored by Nazi leadership. Morell was widely regarded as unscrupulous and unscientific, yet Hitler trusted him completely. The treatments included methamphetamine-based stimulants, a German form of oxycodone, and bizarre animal-derived hormone injections. The long-term effects on Hitler's physical and mental health were likely severe. As the war progressed, Hitler's behavior became increasingly erratic. He suffered tremors, digestive issues, mood swings, and paranoia. While historians debate how much of this can be attributed to harmful substance use, it's clear that Germany's supreme commander was not in stable condition during critical phases of the war. The contradiction is striking. A regime obsessed with control and purity placed absolute trust in a doctor flooding its leader with unregulated harmful substances. Decisions affecting millions of lives were made by a man whose body and mind were being chemically manipulated. That reality makes the course of the war even harder to comprehend. Number 10. Nazi Germany was close to nuclear power, then walked away. Before and during the early years of the Second World War, German scientists were global leaders in nuclear physics. They were among the first to identify nuclear fission, a breakthrough that would later power atomic weapons. What doesn't make sense is how this advantage slipped away. Germany launched a nuclear research effort, but it was fragmented, underfunded, and deprioritized. Nazi leadership favored conventional weapons that delivered immediate results, such as tanks and rockets. Nuclear research was seen as too theoretical, too slow, and too expensive. At the same time, Germany drove away many of its greatest scientific minds through racial persecution. Jewish scientists, including Albert Einstein, fled Europe and ultimately contributed to the Allied Manhattan Project. Bigotry directly weakened Germany's scientific potential. While the US committed vast resources and centralized its nuclear effort, Germany failed to do either. By the time Nazi leadership grasped the potential significance of atomic weapons, the war was already turning against them. Germany's failure to develop nuclear weapons was not inevitable. It was the result of ideological blindness, bureaucratic chaos, and short-term thinking. Ironically, the very traits the regime claimed to despise. Number 9. Japanese Americans were treated worse than captured Nazi soldiers. While German POWs were protected under international law, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes under Executive Order 9066. What doesn't make sense is the stark contrast in treatment. Many of those interned were U.S. citizens, including second- and third-generation Americans with no ties to Japan beyond ancestry. Families were given little time to sell property or businesses, often at a fraction of their value. They were transported to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, living in cramped barracks with limited privacy and harsh conditions. No evidence of widespread espionage or sabotage ever justified these measures. Meanwhile, German POWs, actual enemy combatants, received better housing, food, and legal protections. The irony is deeply unsettling. The U.S. government justified internment as a military necessity, yet later investigations found the policy was driven largely by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria. Decades later, the U.S. formally apologized and offered reparations to survivors. Still, the contradiction remains. A nation fighting fascism abroad violated its own constitutional principles at home. That reality complicates the narrative of the Second World War as a purely moral struggle. Number 8. Winston Churchill helped support a defense-weakening policy before the war. Winston Churchill is remembered as Britain's indomitable wartime leader, the voice that rallied a nation when defeat seemed inevitable. Yet, before the Second World War, Churchill supported policies that undeniably weakened Britain's defenses, a contradiction that often gets glossed over. One of the most significant was the 10-year rule, a policy adopted after World War I that assumed Britain would not face a major war for at least a decade. This assumption allowed successive governments to limit military spending and divert resources elsewhere, leaving Britain increasingly unprepared as global tensions rose. Churchill's involvement complicates his legacy. While serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, he helped maintain this outlook. At the time, the policy didn't appear reckless. Europe was traumatized by the devastation of World War I, economies were fragile, and the British public overwhelmingly wanted peace, not rearmament. In 1930, Churchill himself reflected this mood when he stated that he believed large-scale wars were essentially over for their generation. Few politicians or citizens were eager to imagine another global catastrophe so soon. What doesn't make sense in hindsight is how sharply this optimism clashed with the realities of the 1930s. As Nazi Germany openly rearmed and violated the Treaty of Versailles, Britain's military readiness lagged behind. Aircraft production was insufficient, air defenses were outdated, and mobilization plans were incomplete. To Churchill's credit, he eventually recognized the danger earlier than most and became one of the loudest critics warning about Hitler's ambitions. Still, the paradox remains. The leader who saved Britain in its darkest hour had also played a role in creating the vulnerability that made that crisis so perilous. Number 7. Over 20,000 Americans attended a Nazi rally. The idea that Americans openly supported Nazi Germany before the Second World War feels shocking today, yet it undeniably happened. In February 1939, more than 20,000 people packed Madison Square Garden for a pro-Nazi rally organized by the German-American Bund. The event was staged with deliberate symbolism. Swastikas hung beside American flags, speakers praised Adolf Hitler, and inflammatory rhetoric targeted Jews, communists, and democratic institutions. The rally was not hidden or underground. It was public, permitted, and widely covered by the press. What doesn't make sense at first glance is how such a movement gained traction in a country that would soon fight a brutal war against fascism. Economic desperation played a major role. The United States was still mired in the Great Depression, with unemployment high and confidence in democratic capitalism shaken. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany appeared, at least superficially, to be thriving. Public works projects, declining unemployment figures, and aggressive state planning created an illusion of economic revival that appealed to people searching for order and stability. Racial ideology further fueled support. White supremacist groups in the United States found Nazi racial theories disturbingly familiar and validating. At the same time, many Americans of German descent were hesitant to criticize Germany, particularly after experiencing discrimination and suspicion during and after World War I. To them, the Bund's messaging blended ethnic pride with misplaced patriotism. Although the rally sparked protests and condemnation, it exposed how fear, economic hardship, and social division can weaken democratic values. It serves as a sobering reminder that no society is immune to extremist ideas when conditions are unstable and uncertainty dominates public life. Number 6. The Blitz bombed Buckingham Palace multiple times. Germany's bombing campaign against Britain, known as the Blitz, was designed to crush civilian morale. From September 1940 to May 1941, London and other cities endured relentless air raids. Buckingham Palace itself was bombed multiple times. Conventional logic suggested that sustained terror would force Britain to surrender. What doesn't make sense is that the opposite happened. Rather than collapsing, British morale hardened. Civilians adapted to nightly bombings, sheltering in underground stations, clearing rubble by day, and continuing daily life as best they could. The shared hardship fostered a sense of unity and defiance. The Luftwaffe inflicted massive damage and killed tens of thousands, but it failed strategically. Industrial production continued, air defenses improved, and public support for resistance remained strong. Propaganda celebrating resilience reinforced national identity, turning suffering into a symbol of determination. The Blitz demonstrated a fundamental miscalculation. Fear does not always lead to submission. In Britain's case, it strengthened resolve. Germany expended enormous resources trying to break a population that refused to break, proving that psychological warfare can backfire in ways planners never anticipate. Number 5. Nazi Germany condemned harmful substance use publicly. Nazi ideology placed heavy emphasis on physical purity, discipline, and moral strength. Harmful substance use was publicly condemned, and addicts were portrayed as weak, antisocial, or degenerate. Alcoholism could bring social punishment, and in some cases, even forced sterilization. Yet behind this carefully constructed image was a deeply contradictory reality. The German military depended heavily on harmful substances to function at the pace demanded by modern warfare. The most notorious example was Pervitin, a methamphetamine widely issued to soldiers across multiple branches of the armed forces. What doesn't make sense is the scale of its use. In 1940 alone, more than 35 million Pervitin tablets were distributed to frontline troops. Soldiers were encouraged to take the harmful substance to remain awake for extended periods, sometimes fighting or marching for several days without sleep. During early campaigns, such as the invasion of France, commanders praised its ability to suppress fatigue, heighten focus, and increase aggression, treating it as a tactical advantage rather than a medical risk. The long-term consequences were severe and increasingly visible. Prolonged use led to dependency, hallucinations, paranoia, cardiovascular strain, and mental collapse. Soldiers who initially felt energized later experienced erratic behavior, impaired judgment, and violent outbursts. Medical officers began reporting exhaustion, breakdowns, and declining effectiveness among troops heavily reliant on stimulants. Number 4. Japan failed to destroy U.S. aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shocked the United States and achieved tactical surprise. Battleships were sunk, aircraft destroyed, and thousands killed. Yet what doesn't make sense is how strategically incomplete the attack was. The most critical targets, American aircraft carriers, were not in port that morning. Equally important, Japan failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and dry docks. These installations allowed the U.S. Navy to recover far more quickly than expected. Many damaged ships were repaired and returned to service. Japanese planners debated launching a third strike to eliminate these assets, but ultimately chose to withdraw. That decision preserved the very infrastructure that enabled America's rapid naval resurgence. Within months, U.S. carrier-based forces were pushing back across the Pacific. Japan took an enormous gamble, hoping to knock the U.S. out of the war early. Instead, the attack unified American public opinion overnight. Industrial mobilization followed on a scale Japan could not hope to match. Pearl Harbor didn't cripple the U.S., it provoked it. From a military perspective, it was a stunning operational success paired with a profound strategic failure. The attack ensured a long war Japan was economically and industrially incapable of winning. Number 3. German POWs held in Texas often lived comfortably. Between 1943 and 1945, roughly 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. What doesn't make sense is how humane, and in some cases comfortable, their captivity was. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to decent housing, food comparable to that of their guards, medical care, and protection from abuse. The U.S. largely complied. Many German POWs were housed in rural states like Texas, where land was plentiful. Camps were clean, well-organized, and secure without being oppressive. Prisoners could attend classes, stage theatrical performances, read newspapers, and even earn small wages through voluntary labor. Locals sometimes referred to these camps as the Fritz Ritz, a nickname reflecting how well the prisoners were treated. What's especially puzzling is that escape attempts were rare. Most POWs had little desire to flee, knowing they would likely be recaptured quickly and treated fairly. Some even formed friendly relationships with American civilians, particularly in farming communities where labor shortages created mutual dependence. After the war, many former POWs remembered their time in America positively. A number of them returned later as immigrants, becoming U.S. citizens. The idea that enemy soldiers were treated with dignity, even kindness, during a brutal global war challenges common assumptions about how wars are fought and remembered. Number 2. Some enemy soldiers chose to stay in America. After the war. After the Second World War ended, many German prisoners of war held in the United States faced repatriation. What doesn't make sense is that some of them didn't want to go home, and some never did. Having experienced fair treatment, economic opportunity, and relative stability during captivity, many former POWs viewed America more favorably than post-war Germany, which was devastated and divided. A number returned years later as immigrants, legally settling in the same country they once fought against. This outcome challenges traditional ideas about enemies and loyalty. These men were not coerced or indoctrinated. They made conscious choices based on lived experience. The U.S. treatment of POWs, rooted in adherence to international law, left a lasting impression. The irony is striking. A war meant to destroy enemies ended up persuading some of them that American society was worth joining. It's a reminder that how wars are fought can matter just as much as who wins them. Number 1. The United States prepared for war before the public realized it. The popular narrative suggests the U.S. was dragged reluctantly into the Second World War by the attack on Pearl Harbor. What doesn't make sense is how much preparation had already taken place before December 1941. In September 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, nearly 2.2 million Americans were already in uniform. Military leaders understood that global conflict was increasingly likely. Industrial production was ramping up, alliances were forming, and strategic planning was underway. While the public largely believed war could still be avoided, the government was quietly preparing for the worst. This disconnect reflects the difficulty of balancing transparency with national security. Leaders anticipated war, but struggled to convince a war-weary population. Pearl Harbor didn't start America's mobilization. It revealed it. The idea that the U.S. was caught completely unprepared is comforting, but inaccurate. The machinery of war was already turning. Pearl Harbor simply flipped the switch into full motion. These truths show that the Second World War was far more complex and contradictory than commonly imagined. How did such extremes of strategy, suffering, and irony coexist in one global conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments below.